So how do you paint a very solid and realistic looking parrot's beak? Let me show you what I do and let's get the brushes wet. Hi, my name is Paul Hopkinson, who teaches how to paint wildlife in watercolour through my website and the link down below, and also here on YouTube. Now when I work on a parrot's beak, I want to make sure that it's nice and wet to begin with, but I want that water to soak into the paper. I don't want it kind of running on the top of the surface. Then I can drop the colours in. But the colours are going to be more of a pale version to begin with. And as per usual with watercolour, you want to start off from light and then gradually get darker as you go along. Now this layer will dry lighter as watercolour normally does. But that's not a problem because I want to be able to work in layers anyway as I go along. So by pre-planning a painting before you start, so pre-plan all the colours that you think you'll need, test them out on some scrap watercolour paper as well. I always do that before I even start on a painting, no matter what the colours are. Even if you're fairly confident on the colours that you're going to be using as well. Still test those colours out. Because you'll be surprised at it, because when the colours dry, they can dry a little bit differently, because they fade, so they're not quite as vibrant as they are when they first go onto the paper. So you have to kind of test those kind of ideas out before, as I say, you kind of start putting that paint onto the main painting. So the first layer of this paint is on, and I'm going to gradually increase the layers as I go along. So now I'm going to go in with a slightly kind of darker colour. It's not really dark, still quite pale really, because when this dries, it will still be a little bit pale. But I'm gradually trying to think about the overall shape for the beak, because obviously it's got a round feel to it, hasn't it? But it's also solid and curved at the same time. Now I did notice within this beak there's a little bit of blue, but because I want to maintain the shape of this, I need to keep this light, I need to keep it pale, and just move that paint around. When I'm working with something like this as well, for the initial layered washes, I don't go with really detailed brushes. I tend to prefer more of a slightly larger brush, and a larger brush for me is something like a size 4 or size 5. I know within the watercolour world, that could be quite small, couldn't it? But that's the kind of brush I like to use, So something with a short bristled hair, not easy to say, I know. But that's what I prefer to use when I'm kind of applying the washes down before I go in with all that lovely detail, which I like to work on. But as with every painting that you do, you've got to pre-plan it. So even painting this beak, I'm always thinking about it beforehand. I'm always kind of pre-planning in my head sometimes the kind of layers I want to add on this. And the amount of layers depends on how vibrant you want the colours to be, how dark you want the colours to be. But the worst thing you can do that I've tried and doesn't work is go straight in there with a dark colour, So just make sure that you start off light and gradually work dark, as I've already said. Because if you go too dark too quick, you tend to find that if you make a mistake or like a happy accident, it's very difficult to fix. So it's much easier to fix a mistake when it's very pale kind of details or wash on the paper. So you find them kind of colours a little bit easier to lift off sometimes. Obviously this can depend if it's a staining colour as well. So just bear that in mind. So always make sure that you do start off light. So you've got a little bit of kind of room to play if you need to make any alterations. So let's go in for a slightly darker colour again. So as you can see, this is gradually getting darker all the time. So this is yet another layer. So dampen the paper first of all, just to kind of allow it to blend a bit more. But I've only wetted the paper once and allowed that water to soak in that little bit. Because by at least doing it this way around, the paint won't just float on the surface. It will sink into the texture of the paper, which is what you want it to do. And obviously the wetter the paper, the more it will float, the more it will spread. If it's only damp the paper, then it won't spread quite as far. So if you remember it that way, and just by thinking of, the kind of details that you want on the paper, behind the scenes, so to speak, so before we actually put all them kind of fine details over the top, consider that and consider the wetness of the paper. And if you're not sure, test it out on some watercolour paper first, some scrap watercolour paper that you've got. If you're enjoying this video, please give me a thumbs up down below, or even say a quick hi in the comment section down below as well. I very often use old paintings that are ready for the bin. Don't throw them away, okay? If these are failed attempts, don't throw them away in the bin. Turn them over, cut them into strips of paper, as in, 2-inch wide, anything like that, And then you can use the back of that paper to test the colours on and test your ideas on before going to your main painting. Alright, got the idea? So now what I want to do with this beak is add a little bit more colour over the top. So back into the browns, kind of umbery colours. I want to warm the beak up a little bit as well. But at the same time, again, I'm considering the overall shape of this beak. So it's going to be lighter to the right, obviously, and slightly darker, and it gets really dark actually as it goes over to the left. But I want to keep blending these colours as I go along. I'm trying to keep it nice and reasonably soft, but yet you can see when I'm applying this paint, I'm applying it in the direction that the lines go along the beak all the time, aren't I? Rather than going, kind of across the beak instead. So working with a curved motion. Now, because I'm left-handed, I tend to find doing that kind of curve where it goes from, like from the top right to the bottom left, if you know what I mean. So the right-hand side of a clock face. That's easy for me being a left-handed person because that's the kind of natural flow and movement of my wrist and my hand. If you're trying to do this kind of shape with being right-handed, then I would recommend just turning the paper around and even turning that reference photograph around at the same time. So if you've got a tablet or an iPad or a mobile phone that you've got your reference photograph on that you're working from, rotate that alongside your paper. At least that way you can see things the way they really are rather than thinking, is that the right angle? Okay. So think about it that way around as well. You don't have to sit and work on that same position all the time. So I've wetted the bottom part of the beak, I had a little bit of colour in there, and that's already dry. So now I can start to think about adding some detail. Now the detail brush I'm using is a size 00, so size 2 zeros. And this is quite nice and fine. It's a synthetic brush as well, so Winsor Newton Cotman Series 111, okay, just if you need to know. But I've been using these brushes for years because I do like the synthetic feel. I like the kind of the snap rate, as I say, within the brush as well. But you've also got to think about when you load any brushes, especially even a detail brush, how much paint to put on that brush. What's the consistency of the paint? So these are just a couple of questions you've got to ask yourself before you even go to that paper. So how thick do you want that paint? Do you want it watery, milky, creamy, or thick? So I tend to work with watery and milky initially for the first details on there, and then think about adding more of a creamy version for the final detailed lines. Thick, well, that's literally straight out of a tube, isn't it? So that's what I tend to think of. Also, if you overload that brush, then you find that the lines can be too thick, too dark, and not controlled. So if you load it in the mixing palette, in your well of paint, roll it as you pull out the brush away from the palette, and then tap it once on some kitchen roll or a towel or whatever you use to kind of dampen your brushes on. Then go to the painting, and you'll have a very fine tip to work with. Yes, you won't quite as much paint, and you will have to keep reloading that brush as you're working with it, but at least that way around you'll be able to work with the finer lines as well, which is basically what I'm doing here. Okay, again, I'm thinking about the sweeping motion, the curve of the beak all the time, and I'm varying those colours as well. Now when you compare that to the reference photograph, you can see as you come down maybe a quarter of the way down the beak, the dark area kind of hooks in, doesn't it, to the left, kind of staggers in and back down again, and that's what I've got to try and replicate by using this dark colour. And again, I'm working with a dark colour. Now I want this more to a milky, nearly creamy consistency, because by having it to that consistency, it's going to go really dark on there, but it'll still fade a little bit as it dries. And also, if it's too dark, I can use a lifting off method as well to kind of take a little bit of paint off that paper. Okay, and that's a good way of actually adding extra detail on by removing paint. I know, you think, well hang on, you just put it on, why do you want to take it back off again? Because when you find something you think, actually I could do some fine lines in that beak, you can just remove it that way as well, just by using a damp clean brush. So let me just speed this up a little bit, and what we're going to do is add even more lines on there. Now I'm going to gradually build up the details on this beak. I want to get really detailed now. We've done all the foundation work, haven't we? Or the basic foundation work by adding the numerous layers of colours and washes, allowing each layer to dry as I've gone along. And this is where you can really start to form that beak. This is where you can start to make it more of a three-dimensional shape. And this is also where we go past that, as my members call it, the ugly stage, when you've got a flat 2D image and you've got to turn it into a three-dimensional, more realistic feeling, which is what you need for this particular parrot, or any wildlife that we do. So adding the dark layers in is going to add that extra shape, that extra curve that we need for this beak. But I'm also thinking again about how I'm loading that brush. I'm also thinking again about the angle. My eyes are flicking backward and forward, backward and forward, backward and forward like a broken record towards that reference photograph. Now I have my reference photograph very often positioned directly in front of me. And that's what I'd recommend that you do. Because at least that way around, if it's right in front of you, you can glance backward and forward to that photograph every few seconds. And it'll help you sort of remember where the details are going to go and where it's light and where it's dark on that beak. Okay? But you can use this method for any paintings that you do of wildlife. So anything that you decide that you want to try and paint in detail, you can do that with. So let's go for a larger brush and just use a damp, clean brush to very lightly soften down the beak. Hang on, Paul. You just put all this detail on the beak. I'm just going to wash it away. Well, no, I'm not. I'm not going to wash it away. What I'm actually going to do, I just want to soften it, just kind of knock it back a little bit. Because even though I've got the detail on there, I think it's too sharp, too defined. So by just very lightly, not blending it away, using a damp, clean brush, you can just very lightly soften that down. That kind of helps it merge together that little bit. If that brush was too wet, that'd just blur together, wouldn't it? Like one big mass of colour. Well, one big mess as well it would be. So by doing it this way around with a soft, damp, clean brush, which you've got to keep washing out in between, by the way, otherwise you're just moving paint from one place to another. Okay, so keep washing that brush out. Then this way around, you just kind of soften it back just enough as well. And also, once it's dry, you can even, if you wish to, add even more detail over the top. I mean, how many layers of detail do I want, Paul? Well, I like lots of layers. Because I tend to find the more layers that you have, the more detailed the image will be as well. So this is where we start to go into the really dark colours. So this is a creamy version of that dark kind of blacky colour which we've got. And by adding this in, I can really think about how dark it is right underneath that very bottom of the lower part of the beak. You can see it's really dark down there. But I've allowed some of the colour to show through as you come slightly higher towards this bottom part of the beak. As you can see that it gets a little bit paler, doesn't it, that dark colour. So you can define this, you can really shape this as much as you want to. Now, one thing I like to use is watercolour white. I know it's one of those things which is, some people don't like to use white, some people do like to use white, some people like to use white gouache as well, which you can do. But I like to use white because this will add to the overall feel of the shape, of the solidity of this beak. So when you add this on, we've got the lights, we've got the darks, or we've even got the midtones obviously in between. This will give those bright marks, those really kind of sparkling bright marks towards the beak and really bring that three-dimensional shape together and also make it feel much more realistic. But when you're working with watercolour white, you've got to take your time with it, okay? Don't put too much on. Always think less is best, okay? So less is best. Because if you're not sure if there's enough there, step back, go and take a break, put the kettle on, have a cup of coffee, and then come back with fresh eyes. And then you'll have a clearer and fresher perspective on the painting as well. So then you'll see it with these fresh eyes, and then you can decide then if you want to add some more white in there. Too much white can kill the painting, it can deaden that painting. So only add it where it's needed. You can tone the white down as well with a little bit of colour if you wanted to. So you've got to let it dry, completely dry beforehand though. And then once it's dry, you can just go back in there with a little bit of colour, just like a milky mix of colour, and in one swift pass only, you can go over the top of that white in certain areas to add a bit of colour to it. Any more than one pass, then you will find that you just blur that white away, which you don't want to do obviously. So very lightly go around the beak and look at where all these fine details are going to go. So that'll give us some ideas really how I painted the beak of this lovely colourful parrot. I know, really enjoyed painting this one. And it's also one that my members have enjoyed painting on my website as well. And if you're interested, check out the link down below in the description. Now check out the video to my right where we'll paint another bird using very fine details.